A man walked into a Canadian saloon in 1889, ordered the house special, and didn't recognize a single thing on the plate. This is a list of 10 meals actually eaten in Canadian frontier saloons by outlaws, mounties, and gold rush miners. Some have been erased from the historical record entirely. Others survive only in the diaries of men who couldn't quite believe what they were eating. Number 3 was used as frontier medicine long before anyone understood why it worked. And number 1 was the one thing nobody, outlaw or lawman, ever turned down. Number 10, bannock. Before the supply wagons reached the Western Territories, there was flour and there was fire. That was enough. Bannock was the bread of the Canadian frontier, flat, dense, pressed by hand, and cooked in a cast iron pan or on a rock near the coals. No rising time, no kneading. A cook could produce fresh bread in under 20 minutes if the fire was right. Cree and Ojibwe peoples had made versions of this bread for generations before a single saloon was built. Voyageurs carried the recipe across thousands of miles of wilderness. Mounties ate it on winter patrols stretching for weeks across frozen prairie. A warm piece of bannock with black tea at the end of a brutal day was something men wrote home about decades later, still remembering exactly how it tasted. Number 9, salt pork and boiled peas. Salt pork arrived at frontier trading posts in wooden barrels packed tight with salt. It survived months without refrigeration, which made it indispensable from the Atlantic coast to the Yukon. Saloon cooks fried it thick until the fat ran clear, then threw dried split peas into the same pot and let everything simmer for hours. By 1880, a barrel of salt pork cost roughly $2. A sack of peas cost almost nothing. Together they fed a room full of men for less than a working man earned in a day. Men ate it 4 days in a row without complaint, because the alternative was going to bed hungry in weather that could kill you. Number 8, rubaboo. Almost nobody today knows what rubaboo was. That is worth stopping on, because for 2 centuries it was the meal that held the Canadian wilderness together. It was the food of the voyageurs, French-Canadian fur traders paddling thousands of miles through the boreal forest. Dried bison meat pounded with rendered fat, dissolved in boiling water, thickened with flour into a dense, dark stew that sat in the stomach like a slow-burning fire. The Hudson's Bay Company fed it to their men by the barrel. Outlaws on the run ate it cold from a saddlebag. By the time saloon kitchens inherited the recipe, it had been dressed up slightly, but the principle never changed. A man who needed to work could not afford to stop. Number 7, moose nose jelly. When a moose was slaughtered on the northern frontier, nothing was wasted. Not the hide, not the bones, and not the nose. The fatty upper muzzle went into a pot for hours until the collagen broke down completely and the liquid set overnight into a rich, savory jelly, sliced cold and eaten on bannock the next morning. Cree hunters had considered it a delicacy for generations. The flavor was mild and deeply savory. It was the appearance that troubled the journalists who came north to cover the gold rush. A pale, trembling slab of dark jelly. Most of them left it untouched. The men who had been out in the cold for 3 weeks ate every last piece. Here is something the history books quietly leave out. The Northwest Mounted Police were sent west in 1873 to shut down the illegal whiskey trade, destroying indigenous communities along the frontier. Those same Mounties stopped at the same saloons as the men they were chasing, sat at the same tables, ate from the same pot. The frontier was not large enough for separate dining rooms, and the cook did not ask which side of the law you were on before he handed you a plate. Number 6, pemmican with dried Saskatoon berries. Pemmican was survival in its most concentrated form. Bison meat dried until every drop of moisture was gone, pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat, and pressed into dense cakes that fit in a saddlebag and lasted for months. The Hudson's Bay Company bought it by the ton. Outlaws crossing the border from Montana carried it because it was the one food that never failed. The version made with dried Saskatoon berries, small, dark, somewhere between a blueberry and a cherry, was considered the finest. The berries added just enough sweetness to make something built entirely for function taste. Briefly, like something worth remembering. Number 5. Boiled rabbit with wild onion. Snowshoe hares were everywhere across the Canadian boreal forest. A man who knew how to set snares could eat through a winter that would otherwise have killed him. Saloon cooks boiled rabbit with wild onions from the riverbanks, dried peas when available, and whatever fat could be spared from the salt pork barrel. The result was thin, pale, and quiet in flavor. It was also hot. In February in the territories, that was the only thing that mattered. Number 4. Bison tongue. While the rest of the bison was jerked or rendered, the tongue received different treatment. Slow braised for hours in salted water, then sliced thick and served warm, or pressed cold and eaten the next morning with bannock and strong tea. The flavor was rich and faintly sweet, more delicate than the shoulder, more interesting than anything else on the saloon menu. By the 1880s, as bison herds collapsed under commercial hunting pressure, tongue became genuinely scarce. The men eating it in those years didn't know it would disappear from the Canadian table within a generation. They just knew it was the best thing the cook had made all week. Number 3. Marrow bone broth. When an animal was slaughtered near a saloon kitchen, an experienced cook saved the leg bones. He cracked them open, dropped them into a heavy pot with cold water, and let everything simmer for hours until the liquid turned deep amber and coated the back of a spoon. Men recovering from frostbite were given marrow bone broth. Mounties who had ridden too far in temperatures that had no business being survivable. Outlaws who arrived at the saloon door barely standing. What we now sell at wellness counters for $14 a cup was the everyday medicine of the Canadian frontier. Cooks knew without laboratories that bones contained something the body needed. They knew it because the men who drank the broth recovered, and the men who didn't sometimes didn't. Number 2. Klondike sourdough hotcakes. When gold was discovered in the Yukon in 1896, roughly 100,000 people attempted the journey north. Most didn't make it. The ones who did carried sourdough starters pressed against their bodies in cloth pouches to keep the wild yeast alive at 50 below. A working starter was worth more than most of what a man carried into the Klondike. Lose it to cold or contamination, and you faced a winter of bannock and nothing else. Saloon cooks along the Yukon River built their entire morning reputation around sourdough hotcakes. Thick, slightly sour, cooked in lard until the edges crisped. A stack with molasses cost 25 cents in Dawson City. Men waited in line in the cold to pay it. Some of those starters had traveled from San Francisco, passed between cooks for so many years that nobody remembered where they began. Fed and kept warm each night because the ability to make bread from almost nothing was as close to security as most men ever got. Number 1. Tea, bannock, and whatever you got. When the pemmican ran out, there was rabbit. When the rabbit was gone, there was bone broth. When the broth was finished, there was tea. Hot and dark and strong enough to make a man believe he could ride one more day through cold that had no business being that cold. Outlaws drank it, Mounties drank it, miners, trappers, and saloon keepers sat at the same tables and drank it without a word about who owed who anything. The frontier had a way of making those distinctions feel less important than they did back east. The Canadian frontier did not run on gold or whiskey or wanted posters. It ran on fire, fat, and whatever was left in the pot at the end of a day that had asked everything of the men who lived it. Almost every one of these meals has been completely forgotten.